to answer them. If there are no questions, let me know. John, can you see my screen?
No, not at the moment.
Okay. What about now?
There we go. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So again, if you have questions from the last meeting, please feel free and ask. And if you need clarification, I'll be happy to answer. If there are none, then we'll just go ahead with what we started from our last week's discussion. So remember from our last discussion, we ended up with an all-important equation in terms of the demand for money, how much money we tend to demand in an economy. Obviously, depends on the fact that I have my money demand equation, which depends on P as a function of L here, and I can place in the variables that we determined earlier. So one important indication here is I'm no more representing with X of R, but rather just R. It's just the same thing, just to make our lives easier. Initially, we had an equation that looks like this, M of D as a function of P as a function of L, Y minus X of R. Now, this was our equation that we saw from the last week. The P is still the P, nothing has changed. This is a function. You might want to call it F or you might want to call it L. It doesn't really make a difference. This is our Y, which is just here. And this is the function, the demand for credit that is highly dependent on the interest rate that has been promised. So instead of writing this entire equation, we'll just write it as this so that we clearly capture the most important things here. So demand for money depends on price, depends on output, and depends on the nominal interest rate that has been promised on our bond. Questions? So this will be the equation that I'll be using from now just to make our lives easier. Is there anyone with any question in there? Yeah, so L here is just a function. So you might want to call it, in the case of our production function, we saw a function looks like this.
We have a question here.
Sure.
Someone asks, what is L?
Good. So L is, remember this guy here, back in the Solo model and the Malthusian model, we have something that looks like this, K as a function of this. So L here is just the F that represents a function. So if not being given a functional form, it might be linear, it might be non-linear, or what's not. For now, we just represent it with an F. So if I'm to come and tell you that, hey, this is how it goes, then you can make a decision. Okay, so that's basically it. Again, this is, yeah, all good, John?
Yep, no questions.
So this is the function for the demand for money. And remember what we saw from our last week's discussion. We ended by looking at the very last diagram. Within the credit market, we saw credit to look like this. This is a supply for credit from the banks. And this is the price of the credit that they provide. The higher the price of the credit, the higher the supply they tend to give us. And we ended by looking at the x-axis, which basically takes care of the supply of credit or perhaps the demand of credit that we have in equilibrium. So this happens to be the first part of the supply curve. Now the second part of the curve within the same market was the demand side of it. So we ended by looking at the demand as well. And I believe you all remember that demand depends on Q, which is equal to big R. And that was given to us from the cost benefit analysis of holding bond versus holding credit, as in which one you would like to use in your transaction. So this was perhaps the last graph that we saw before the close of Tuesday. And the equation I just finished writing up was the last equation that we saw before the close of Tuesday. And Alex had very good question pertaining to what each variable represents over there. So if you still have questions over there, please draw my attention. I'll come back to it and further resolve it. So given that we have this, this equation, there are a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. So if this is my demand curve and this is my supply curve, the question here is, what happens when the demand increases? It's fairly obvious that if this is my initial supply in equilibrium, with an increase in demand for credit, whenever there is an increase in demand for credit, the line will go towards this direction. So this represents the increase in demand. The bankers will be happy to help you out if you are going for credit. So the supply of credits will equally increase and it will come with a higher price. So if this is my initial nominal interest rate with what's happening in the market, given this higher demand for credit, the prices for credit will tend to increase as well. So this will be the second part of what we need to understand. Get to know what happens to the transition process as to the price for credit and the price of bond, and then the supply of them. Another important exercise that you might want to have a look at when analyzing this credit market is what happens to this supply curve, given this initial demand. So given that this is my supply curve, if the supply of credit tends to reduce to x of 2, which is a function of Q, what happens to this guy here? So we still have the same, technically the same, what's the name? Q, but we have this guy coming down. So these are a couple of things that you need to be playing around with and see where things will fall out. Questions?
Yes. When is the quiz? Is it today or next Thursday?
I believe we did talk about it on Tuesday, right? So we pointed out that our quiz was supposed to be on a Thursday next week. Okay. John, was that the question?
Yes. Oh, and then we have another one. Can you repeat the part where XS moved?
Oh, so here, remember XX guy, this guy here is technically the supply of credit, right? So here I'm just trying to see what happens to the prices, what happens to the supply of credit in the market when there is a reduction in supply. Remember, if this is my supply curve, when I ask you guys for a reduction, it goes towards this direction. This implies reduction because of the supply, and this guy here represents an increase in supply. So I'm just trying to see how we can move those curves given what I point out, be it an increase or be it a decrease. And what will be the implication? Was that a question, John?
Yes, I think so.
If there are more questions, please feel free. Let me know if I can help. Obviously, I can do that. So this happens to be perhaps the final part of the credit market. Get to see how to make those analyses over there. The next part of our discussion for today, we'll be looking.
Sorry, we have another question here.
Sure, go free.
So when does it increase or decrease? What happens that leads to it increasing or decreasing?
Oh yeah, sure. So imagine that the government has realized that there are a lot of banks in the market, and most of them are pretty much involved in illegal activities, right? So the government is not really okay with a lot of banks. So the government is going to say that, hey, I'm going to put a requirement. If you happen to be a bank and you don't have this, you don't have that, your license will be taken away from you. So if your license is taken away from you, the next bank doesn't also have a license, and technically we have a lot of banks exiting the market, then the credit card that will be provided is going to be very small, right? So the supply of credit in the market is going to be very small because we have lesser banks in the market. That's one side of the supply reducing. Another side of the supply increasing is that the government goes like, hey, we want more investment. So if you happen to be a bank and you would like to invest in Canada, come in. So when they come in, they also, promise a couple of credit cards, and people will go for it. So that there will be increase in supply. So this is how to look at it from that perspective. Questions?
None at the moment, no.
Okay. So we are done with the credit market. We are done with how people make decisions as to whether to use credit or cash to make their transaction. It's left for us to go back to the equation that we just finished writing up. Remember, we had the money demand equation was equal to P as a function of, remember, L represents the function. We had Y here and we had R here. Couple of things from last week, we realized that when prices increase, this guy increases. So 1, 1. These guys are positively related. When output increases, which is Y, this guy also increases. So there is a positive relationship between output and demand for money as well. Your demand for cash, when this guy increases, this guy reduces, because the higher the nominal interest rate, you wouldn't want to transact with cash. You rather use your cash, buy the bond, get the higher interest rate, and use more of the credit card. So this has been the 3 relationships that we saw. This is positive, and this is the only negative aspect of it. Is that okay with everyone? As interest rates increases, as R increases, investments in bond increases. So you use your cash to buy bond, which implies your demand for cash reduces. That's why it's negatively related. So when this guy is up, this guy is down. Is that okay with everyone? Questions?
Actually, I was just curious. So
Yeah.
if the interest rate increases, then we assume that the demand for money decreases because people are using the money to buy bonds, correct?
Exactly.
So I don't know, I might be off base here, but when the interest rate increases and people want to buy more bonds using the money, wouldn't the demand for money go up instead because they want more money to buy bonds? Or I think I'm misunderstanding that.
Correct. That's a good question. So remember, the demand for money that we are trying to think about here is a demand for money for transactions, right?
Oh, okay.
So we assume that you initially have $100 in your pocket, and with this $100, you might want to use it for a specific transaction. Now, given this $100 and given an increase in interest rate, are you willing to go with using the money for direct transaction, or are you willing to shift the money away to the bank, right? So we assume that you do have your initial position, and whether you are willing to use it for direct transactional purposes or you are willing to use credit instead, right? So here with your cash, you are not willing to use your cash for transactions whenever there is a high interest rate, because you just move the cash away to the banks. So your demand for money in transactions are lesser.
Okay.
Yeah. So your demand for money used for transactions are lesser.
And then we have another question. So when we say transactions, are we meaning transactions to exchange for goods and services?
Exactly. So remember, it all depends on why, right? So we had an equation from last week that says there is this big one. This is what we would like to use for, this is the transactions that we need, right? This is the entire output. We can buy this output using either credit or we can buy it using cash. But we wouldn't be willing to use cash here whenever there is a high chance of getting more on our cash. We can get more on our cash when the interest rate is high. So there's going to be less of the cash to Y and more of the credit.
Okay.
Is that yeah? Questions?
No questions right now, no.
Good. So this happens to be the entire how to think about it, whether you might want to use cash for your transaction or you might want to use credit for your transaction. It all depends on the interest rate that has been promised. The higher the interest rate, the less willing you are to use your cash, because you just push your cash to bond and go and borrow to finance your transaction. If that's okay with everyone, then I might want to come down here and break this guy down. So remember, R is a function of two things. It's a function of the nominal the inflation rate and then the real interest rate, just like what we saw in the Fisher's equation, if you quite remember. So from the Fisher's equation, we saw that your big R, which is your nominal interest rate, equals inflation rate plus your real interest rate. So the money demand equation ends up being MD equals P L Y I plus R. And one little thing that the book did was to assume that the inflation rate is zero or constant. It doesn't change over time, which basically implies that we just have this relationship. Y as a function of small r. So having gotten this guy down, it's left for us to draw it on a graph, and this is going to be the graph. So we now have the money demand equation, which looks like this: MD as a function of P as a function of Y and small r. This guy here, I believe they place him here. And this guy here, they place him here. This and this are positively related, so I can just draw a graph that looks like this. So this becomes my money demand equation, wherein my MD would just be the same as P as a function of Y and small r. So this is my money demand equation. This is the graph. Is there anyone with any question?
None at the moment, no.
So let's imagine, just coming back to what Osama was trying to ask in terms of the credit market. Let's imagine a question comes in terms of analyzing this demand function, and it goes like, what happens to this line when income increases? When income increases. Remember, income happens to be what? When income increases, or when GDP increases, or when we tend to have a booming economy. What happens to the demand for money? It's fairly simple to see, because remember, we already established the fact that this guy is positive related to this. So we might have an increase in demand. Y2, this is Y1. John, can you see from there?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So this is what we can see, like play around with it, get to ask yourself, what happens when this guy goes up? What happens when this guy goes up? A very simple question to ask yourself is, what happens when R, which is the interest rate, increases? What happens to the line? Where does it go to? Anyone to help us? What happens when R increases?
Would it go up?
Yeah.
Or left, yeah.
Yeah, it will move towards the left, right? Because our demand for money reduces. Because interest rate is high, we don't want to use money for transactional purposes. We rather use our cash buy bonds and go and borrow and get credit for our transactional purposes. So this is what we need to understand in terms of changing the demand. So if this is okay with everyone, then I'll go a step further to complete this money market. Sure. Is there a question, John?
Yes. Can you explain why MD is not on the y-axis and P on the x-axis?
Yeah. So this is because they are positively related. It doesn't really matter as to where I put them in the first place. Remember, I can just place this guy here and make my P the function and make the D here. It doesn't really cause anything. But you tend to see the essence of it when we include the supply market into the equation. There we see what's happening much clearer. So this question is also consistent with 103 or 102. When you draw your demand and supply curves, you realize that we mostly put prices here and we put quantity here. So this is what they call the inverse demand function, right? So this is the inverse demand function to make things much easier for us to plot and see where the dynamics, yeah. So it's a very good question and it doesn't make any difference. It's just an inverse. Questions, John?
Nope, that was the last one.
Good. So this is what we are done with here. We now know what the demand line is. We now know what the supply line is. To complete this market or to complete this graph, we have to bring into the picture one important player here. We call the person the central bank. Remember, this happens to be a monetary intertemporal model, which implies money is needed for our transactions. So if money is needed for transactional purposes, the question here is, who provides the money? And the answer is the money is coming from the central bank. That's one part of it. That's a very narrow aspect of it. Now, if you want to go a step further and further understand what's going to happen, you might want to ask yourself, who controls this central bank? And to make life easier, we'll just say it's being controlled by the government. So the government is technically the same as the central bank. So this central bank comes in, and the sole purpose of the central bank here is the money supply. It supplies money to the economy, the money that we need for our transactional purposes. And the good news here is it's not really related to price, right? So the money supply that we get from the central bank is not a function of price in any way as of now. So if we like to place the actions of the central bank somewhere here, we will just draw a line, a vertical line here, regardless of the price, nothing happens. So they have a given level of money supply that they give us, which is vertically given to us here, and that's the end of it. They just supply the money, and that's the end of the row. If we come in to analyze the monetary and physical aspects of it, then we tend to see how they will respond when the economy is down or when the economy is overheating. But for now, we just assume that they supply money regardless of the price level, and we are given this vertical supply curve, and it's being given to us by the central bank. So we now have the supply side of it, and we now have the demand side of it. And the two will end up giving us what we call the price in equilibrium, right? So we now have a complete market to analyze. If you have questions, please let me know before we go ahead. Questions? John?
Actually, I have a question. So the money supply is constant then,
yeah.
Is that correct? Oh, well, yeah. Yes, okay, but the equilibrium, what do you call it, production or amount of money in the economy will not be constant.
It depends, right? So the amount of money in the economy will also be constant depending on the actions of the central bank. So that's a good question. So this is the quantity of money, be it money supply or money demand. So if the central bank decides to give us this amount of money supply, which might be somewhere here, let's call it M1 fixed. this will surely be constant. The supply of it will surely be constant. The price in equilibrium will also be constant somewhere here. But your question will be interesting when we analyze the actions of the household or the firms. So for instance, when the household comes in and make a decision based on an increase in Y, we might see something of this nature. We might see a different demand function based on this Y increment. Your question will be, we still have the same amount of money supply. That wouldn't change, right? Because the central bank hasn't made any decision after this action from the household. We still have the same amount of money supply, but we might have a different price level in equilibrium. Unless the central bank comes in and changes it. Is that okay, John? Did I answer your question?
Yeah, you answered my question. There's another question here though. If the graph shows like this, any change in MS or MD will change equilibrium price. So why do we still assume inflation rate to be 0 if it's supposed to be changed by prices?
Yeah,
so it's supposed to be changed by prices.
Exactly, that's a good question. It depends on where we take the initial money supply, right? So if, for instance, we assume that the central bank increases the money one time, and I think I'll come back to that when we look at the neutrality of money. If you assume that the central bank, increases the money one time, and that's the end of it, there's no increase thereafter, there's not much for us to say. But if there's a constant change in money period after period, then the consistency is there, and the change in the level of inflation will keep up going up. There we can make a precise decision and then say that indeed inflation is changing over time. But for now, we are just looking at one period analysis, getting to see what happens when this guy goes up or goes down. And because of the changes in prices, there's a tendency for the inflation rate to also increase. That I agree with you. But how consistent is this changing going on? Is it consistent over time? Then we'll have a consistent inflation increase. Is it just a one time? Then we don't have much to say in terms of the inflation. Is that okay with Alex? Yeah. Further questions?
No, not right now.
Good. So now that we have the equilibrium market in terms of the supply and then the demand, we understand how to draw them. I think the next line of action is to understand where the government also comes in. So for now, let's quickly look at what the government does. Remember, the action of the government is through the central bank. That's one thing we have to keep in mind. So I'm going to claim this guy and further analyze the actions of the government. So the question that Alex just finished asking is a very important question, and you might need it to understand the neutrality of money. And I'll show you guys where to read to further get clarification on. So let's see the government equation in the current period. Remember, the expenditure of the government is coming from G plus 1 plus R B. I'll come back and simplify this further. Equals T plus B plus M minus M. So I'll come back and simplify it further. For the sake of the nominal actions here, we might want to put P here because of the prices that comes into play whenever we want to buy something. And the government's action here comes with a P. So the government spends, this is the government spending.
We have a question here.
Sure, feel free.
Is that B looking one there, is that a B or beta?
It's B, but I'll come back and make the difference in terms of which B. So remember, the B is the bond, right? The B is the bond that the government issues. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So this becomes more or less what we know already. The government spending, technically, when we have a very simple model, we basically said that the government spending, G, is the same as T. This was a simple model that we had. Whatever the government spends comes from the taxes that it takes away from us. Now the question here is, it might not be able to finance its spending solely from taxes. It might have to borrow. So there's a need for the government to borrow, which is the B, to further finance its spending. Now, the new idea here is the government now has a power to print money. To print money, we have to look at the net amount of money supply in the economy. So the difference between the amount of money supply in the current economy, which I call M current, minus the amount of money supply in the past period. So the net amount of money the government is able to print for this period comes in as a form of revenue for it. So you might want to call it seigniorage. Whenever the government prints money, it's called seigniorage. So the government gets this further revenue from printing money. It gets revenue from borrowing. It gets revenue from the taxes. Again, because we now have prices playing a role in terms of the nominal aspects of the economy, there's going to be P here, there's going to be P here. So that's the first part of our analysis. Now, the question here is, not only does the government spend for expenditure purposes in terms of road and hospitals, the government will also have to come in and pay all the borrowing that it did for the previous year. So the past borrowing that it did, it has to come back and pay. So here, in addition to this, there's going to be an expenditure on the amount of borrowing that it did. So this is the B that you borrowed in the past. So this is the expenditure aspect for this model, and this is the income aspect or the revenue aspect for the government. And the only new idea here is the fact that they now print money to further support their budget. So we have revenue here. Questions? John?
Nope, not right now.
Good. So if we understand the makeup of this model, let me just further break it down. So this is the past, this is the current, this is the past. So I have P, G, spending on roads and hospitals, spending on paying your loans from the past period, which is minus, beta, your loan from the past period, the bonds that you issue from the past period that you have to pay. This is the revenue that you get. This is the revenue that you get from borrowing. This is the difference between the amount of money that you supply.
We have a question here.
Free, shoot it.
Can you explain the M current minus M past part again?
Yeah, so this might be a difficult one to explain, but imagine that the measurement of money in the first place, or the amount of money in circulation for every period. If, for instance, you promise us that you're going to supply a given amount of money, maybe $100 worth of money for every period. So this is the amount of money that you promise us every year. So over time, so today, you're just going to print $100. Tomorrow is just going to be $100, nothing more. And this $100 are needed for transactional purposes. So when they use it for transactions, that's the end of it. But if you happen to change the amount of money supply from $100 that you promised to 120 for the next period, the question here is, where does the extra 20 go to? Right? So the extra 20 that you have is basically an increase in money supply. And that's what we call a seigniorage. and that comes to you as a government in the form of revenue. And it's obviously going to increase inflation. I'll look at that. That'll be back to what Alex was trying to ask earlier. And this inflation is just, you might want to call it inflation tax. So whenever you promise a given amount of money, but you rather end up increasing more or printing more, the extra printing that you do is the extra revenue that you have. Question?
Okay. Yes. Okay. So the new money they print is a benefit to them?
Exactly. Yeah. And this benefit is what they call inflation tax or seigniorage. All good?
All good.
Okay, good. So we are done with what the government does. And the question here is, one of the analysis that they try to do here is, imagine a situation where if this is the amount of money supplied, the difference between the current period and then the previous period. So let me call this guy 2 and this guy 1. If this guy happens to increase because M2 increases, we need to make 1 or 2 analysis. When increase in money supply, when money supply increases from the government, couple of things we need to do a couple of things to balance this equation. First of all, either G will have to increase to match the increase in money supply, and that makes sense. So whenever government is in trouble and the government will need to maybe build roads, hospitals and whatnot, and it doesn't have the money, it might want to print more money to finance the extra spending. So whenever the money supply increases, it might go to extra money spending. That's one part of it. It might not be the case that this increase in money supply goes to government spending. The question here is, where will it go to? These guys are in the past, so we can't make any decision on them. One thing you might want to see here is this guy, T. When money supply increases, given that these guys are fixed, then it might be the case that this guy should go down to balance this equation, and that makes sense. The extra money that the government printed, if it doesn't go into providing roads and hospitals, which is G, then it might go into reducing taxes for people. So that's what we call tax break. And this is what they call the helicopter drop. That is basically the government just go print money and start sharing it to people. And sharing money to people is just the opposite of taxes, which is subsidy. Question? Question, John?
My apologies, I was muted. Does it have any relationship with Ricardian equivalence? It might, but that would be a sophisticated way of looking at it. Again, with the Ricardian equivalence, then that means we have to break this guy down and look at the differences. Yeah, it might. Look at the taxes, look at the nature of the taxes, put it there, and you see how the Ricardian equivalence comes out of it. Is that okay? So in a situation where the government promises a constant amount of money supply, then we just have the usual budget constraint of the government that we saw in the earlier chapters. But whenever the government increases the money supply and reduces taxes, then maybe the Ricardian equivalence might not hold, because people believe that it just comes to them. Question? Yes. Would not printing more money cause the value of currency to fall, or is this a separate topic?
It is related. So that's a good question. By printing more money, we'll come back, we'll just look at it very shortly. What we need to see is that it will increase inflation. So the raw return is just going to be very small. It's related, but it goes through prices. So that's why I call it inflation tax. So the value of money comes down in a way. Yeah. Questions?
Nope.
Good. So it might also not be the case that the government is using it for G, neither is it using it for T. It might be using it to reduce the borrowing that it does. So that will be another aspect, that's the extra print of money where it might go into. Is that okay with everyone? So this is what to look at in terms of the new budget constraint of the government. If everyone is fine, then we can go ahead. If not, I'll just pause and see whether you guys have questions. If you happen to be in the chat room, please type your full name and type present, and let's see what to do after that. All good? Okay. And again, as I promised, whenever you come in late after the attendance, please don't write your name, because I'm obviously going to cancel it, and I will just take those that I have within a certain time limit. So just keep an eye on the timing. So let me quickly clean this guy here and move towards the final aspect of it. We've moved from chapter 12 to chapter 11, and the only difference here is within chapter 11, we've now introduced in the idea of money. Okay, so I have this guy here. So I'm just going to go back to chapter 11, what we saw in chapter 11. What we saw in chapter 11 was that we saw the labor market, which was this guy here, which was the amount of labor demanded. And we saw this guy here, which was the amount of labor supply. And remember, this guy was a function of the real interest rate. And it gives us a certain amount of employment level. And I believe this was the wage rate in the market. And this is going to be the wage rate. The second market that we saw was the output market. But for the sake of time, we can just get rid of it and analyze the output market. So we have the output and we have the output as well. We have the demand and we have the supply. This is the demand and this is the supply. This is the supply and this is the demand. At the end of the day, they both determine what the raw interest rate in the market needs to be. So I have R here, I have the output in equilibrium. Questions? Questions?
No.
Good. So these were the two graphs that we came across in chapter 11, I believe, or chapter 10, if I'm right. What we are going to add here is the idea of the money market. Remember, within the money market, as Ella pointed out, why do we put prices here? And we have the money supply and the money demand here. And then the supply of the money is technically fixed. We don't have much to say in terms of the money supply because it just comes from our central bank. How much is supplied depends on them. And we also have the money demand, which is a function of a couple of things, which is a function of money demand as a function of P, as a function of Y, as a function of R. So this will be the update to our existing graph. Just this guy here, the money market, because we now have a monetary intertemporal model. John, question?
No, sir. No questions.
Good. So our exercise here is to see what happens to an increase in money supply in this economy. What happens to money supply? Does it affect our output? Does it affect how much we decide to work? Does it affect any real factors in the economy? Remember, the raw factors happen to be the W, the N, the output, and all that. So imagine a situation where the central bank decides, so this is P1, decides to increase money supply one time only. So back to what Alex was trying to ask. One time only, our initial inflation point was 0 and nothing more than that. There's a one-time increase in money supply. So money supply goes up. So money supply 2. What do we see here? What we tend to see here is that the prices in the market will tend to increase. It moves from P1 to P2. The reason why we say money is neutral is what I'm about to do right now. So make sure you stop me if it's not clear. Money supply has increased. And what we saw was that prices will increase as well. The question here is this line a function of price? No. Is this line a function of price given the assumptions that we have right now? No. So these two lines are not going to be affected. So the amount of output in equilibrium is also not going to get affected, and the amount of wage in equilibrium is also not going to get affected. So we have a constant N and W, which wouldn't change because these lines are not changing due to the fact that P is not affecting them. So that's one part of it. Now, if labor is not changing, will the amount of output supply change? The answer here is no, because this guy also is not directly affected from this P perspective. This guy, the same thing. So we have the same amount of R, the same amount of output. The only difference here is with an increase in money supply, there's going to be a consistent and equal amount of price increment that will just balance it off in the money market or in the nominal frame. So with an increase in money supply, no real variable is affected. Our output remains the same. Our amount of labor supply remains the same. The nominal interest rate remains the same, given the assumptions that we have. So this is why we call money to be neutral. So when the central bank decides to increase money supply, we don't expect output to increase, neither do we expect the amount of hours of work to increase or the wages to increase. It will just be offset. It will get offsetted by the fact that the money supply the prices will also increase.
We have a question here.
Sure.
Why will changes in P not affect labor supply? Or will people choose to work more to support consumption?
No, so I think I should be much clearer here. So remember labor supply, we just made a point. We had a stand that labor supply always depends on the raw interest rate. That's what we had in this model. Nothing about what's the name? The income aspect or whatever. The only assumption that we made here was that labor supply just depends on the raw interest rate. So on the basis of that, we don't see any price change affecting it. And remember, imagine that this extra money supply came to you. Okay, so this is a story. Maybe that will make things much easier. You happen to buy Tim Hortons. Every 1 cup of Tim Hortons that you bought, you happen to pay $5 for it. Right? Every cup of Tim Hortons, you happen to pay $5 for it. Your dad or your mom happens to be the central bank. The next morning, your mom gave you $50. Imagine your mom gave you $50. So initially you used to buy 1 cup of Tim Hortons for $5, and your mom used to give you $5. Now your mom is giving you $50. The question here is, how many cups of Tim Hortons can you buy? Anyone to help me?
Wouldn't it be 10?
10, it will be 10, right? So you can buy 10 cups of Tim Hortons, right? With this $50. So with an increase in money supply, we assume that you might be willing to buy more cups of coffee. But you go to the coffee shop and they also tell you that, hey, you know, prices have increased. Instead of 1 cup of coffee going for $5, now 1 cup of coffee is going for $50. How many cups of coffee can you buy then? Just one, right? So there is no real impact in the market. Nothing has changed. So just with this nominal change, we don't expect any real thing to happen in the market. And that's the whole argument. So Alex, back to your question. Imagine with this increase in money supply, it came to you as a form of tax reduction or helicopter drop, right? Or free money. You might think of it as you being able to buy more, but at the end of the day, prices will equally increase to meet that money supply. So nothing has changed in the market. Is that okay? If it's not clear, we can take an example maybe to make it much clearer. So the argument is, as money supply, we only consider our changes, we only consider our, So with an increase in money supply, prices will increase, and with an increase in prices, we don't expect, with an equal increase in prices, we don't expect the real, anything in the real market to change. Questions? If you have questions, please let me know. John?
No questions at the moment, no.
Okay. So finally, let's look at what will lead to shifts in money demand and money supply markets and how that will affect. I think we looked at it in terms of money demand, so I wouldn't look at it again. The supply of credit. So back to Osama's question, in terms of what do we think will lead to shifts in money demand or perhaps shifts in money supply? If you go to the book, I believe page 350, you tend to see a couple of factors: new information, government regulation, riskiness in banks, and all that. Right? So just let me know if you have questions. I'll be happy to help with that.
Somebody asks, can we have a 5-minute break before we continue?
I'm just about to take the 5 minutes break, and we'll come back and look at chapter 3. So just give me 5 minutes. We'll finish at 31 or 32. Then you guys will take 5 minutes break. Okay, sorry.
Okay.
Sure. So coming back to what you guys were asking us, what might lead to the shifts, the book happened to capture 1 or 2 changes. So this will be a form of discussion. So money demand, what might lead to shifts in money demand, and what might lead to the credit supply and all that. So remember, this guy happens to be our money demand. This is our prices. This happens to be the function. This happens to be Y. This happens to be the interest rates, be it R or small r. 1, imagine that you have new information or new ways of having credit card. So if you look at this, we have information technology that will help us hold more credit card. So if you have a technology that helps with more credit card, what happens to money demand? So what happens to money demand if this technology goes up? An example of the technology exactly. So imagine the situation where you have more ATM machines. So with more ATM machines, everyone will be holding a credit card. because they can just go use the ATM machine and use it for their transaction. Nobody will want to hold cash any longer. So when technology increases, we believe that the amount of money demand will also increase. 2, you might also want to look at the risk associated with holding money. When the risk associated with holding money goes up, people might not be willing to hold more money because they are afraid that someone will just come in and take away the money from them. They are more willing to go with credit. 3, the regulation requirements by the bank. Maybe they might want you to hold a certain amount of money in the bank and you cannot take more than a certain amount. If this is the case, you feel restricted, you don't want to put your money in the bank anymore. That will also reduce the money and all that. So just read on that chapter. Let's see whether you have questions, and hopefully you might see it in the midterm or in the finals. Yeah, so this is, I think, just about it in terms of the money market. John, is there anyone with any question before we take the 5 minutes break?
No, not at the moment.
Okay, so we take 5 minutes break. We'll be back, I believe, in about 5 minutes, which is 36. I'll take off the recording and start it again. So just make sure you join us again. So see you guys in 5 minutes. Bye-bye.